Our second gospel reading this morning follows right after the first in timeline, and it is where Jesus has called his first disciples and they in turn call the next. And I'm reminded of this rosebud here, which celebrates the birth of Rocco James Aubin. Rocco is the joyous maternal grandmother of Rocco is Nancy Picciotino, and we are so glad for her. I didn't think you were going to be here today. Congratulations, Nancy. I'm reminded of this because this is a scripture that reminds us God calls us each by name, that God celebrates each one of us here. So with that in mind, friends, let us read from John 1. Hear now these words. The next day, Jesus decided to go to Galilee. He found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter, and Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him, about whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus, son of Joseph from Nazareth." And Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" So Philip said to him, "Come and see." And when Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him, he said of him, "Here is truly an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." And Nathanael asked him, "Where did you get to know me?" And Jesus answered, "I saw you under the fig tree before Philip called you." And Nathanael replied, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." And Jesus answered, "Do you believe because I told you that I saw you under the fig tree? You will certainly see greater things than these." And he said to him, "Very truly, I tell you, you will see the heavens opened and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man." Here ends the reading. May these words I speak in all our meditations bring us closer to you, for you are our rock, our river, and our Redeemer. Amen. I never really learned to swim. My first 5 years were in a small house about a block away from the Missouri River in Pierre, South Dakota. This stretch of the Missouri is not at all impressive. It's very small. But no matter, my parents were terrified that one day, all of a sudden, I would learn to walk and they would turn around and I would be at the river and drown before they noticed. So when I was 5 or 6 months old, they took me to the Y and they threw me in. Literally. That was the philosophy at the time. It turns out that babies, like most mammals, are born with what's called a diving reflex. Somewhere around the age of 6 months, it begins to fade. But until that point, if you put a baby in water, the heart rate will slow, apnea or the lack of the drive to breathe will kick in, the glottis seals the airways, and a baby moves their arms and legs in a way that mimics swimming. Now, they're not actually swimming. Most can't really even hold their heads up at this point, so they cannot maneuver well enough to swim. But their body does immediately protect them. In the same way as when you startle a baby, their arms shoot out to keep them from falling. Now, there's a school of thought that if you introduce a baby to swimming at this time in their life and continue to do so as this reflex fades, the fear of water will never kick in, and the reflex will become a learned behavior. And when a child naturally learns the mechanisms of swimming, it will trust naturally that the water will hold them. This worked for me. In fact, one of my earliest core memories is really a snapshot of a moment at the end of a diving board. I have no idea how I got to the end of the diving board. I have a vague memory of being on my knees because it hurt a little, that rough texture, but I know I was not stable enough to walk through the bounce of a board, and I know there was no one up there with me. So I assume I must have crawled. And I remember peering over, and I remember the sway of the board, and mostly the truly 80s brown tile that was all over the pool, and the deep blue of the water. And there's a whisper of a memory of my father, big 80s beard and red afro, waiting down below in the water. This came to my mind recently because Sam, my 18-month-old, just lost his diving reflex. We thought we had invaded it entirely We'd enrolled him in those 6-month baby classes, and then we took him to the pool regularly all summer. But taking him to the pool with my father recently to show off how bold and brazen he was, Sam was terrified. He was clinging to me and trying to climb up my swimsuit like a tree. It had been several months since we had gone to the pool, and evidently it was too long. Now, if you recline him toward the water, even in the tub, his body gets tense and his arms shoot out and he starts yelling, "No!" There is no reassuring him that it will be okay, not even in the tub. So now I picture him struggling, like most children, like Carolyn, to regain that ease with water. I can see him now just like her, face arched back, eyes squeezed shut, clinging to a noodle or a jacket, panic paddling. And I know it's natural to struggle, don't get me wrong, and I know the learning process of overcoming is an important and good one too. I am not the kind to want to remove every challenge. I think they're starting to call that snowplow parenting, right? But I am sad that we have to start from the beginning with something that could have been so natural. In his sermon, Man's Sin and God's Grace, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spends 3,000 words, 3,000, that's more than double my average sermon length, by the way, 3,000 words talking about human sinfulness before he gets to the concept of grace, on which he spends 500. We all have a private self, he writes, that we are ashamed of, that we forever seek to hide, and that we would never want to become public. This is the sin of man, he writes. There is this conflict between the isness of our present natures and the eternal oughtness that forever confronts us. He quotes Plato with the 2 headstrong horses Plato said we have inside, and he quotes Ovid, the poet, about the good things we approve of and the evil things yet we still do, and H.G. Wells about our internal civil war that we have, and Goethe contemplating that he contains enough inside of him for both a gentleman and a rogue. We know truth, King says, and yet we lie. We know how to be just, and yet we are unjust. We know how to live our lives on the plane of love, and yet we hate or are unfaithful. We know the ways of peace, and yet we go to war. We have resources for great economic systems where there could be equitable distributions of wealth, and yet we monopolize. Now, all throughout this winter, we have been looking at what it is to rejoice when the world is so dark, when we are so tired, when the world itself is weary. We have discussed the importance of stopping, to connect, to allow ourselves to be awed, to sing, to slip into rituals that will hold us with the generations past. But there is one foundation to all of this. It is the last piece. And it relates to what Brené Brown calls belonging or connection being an irreducible need for all people. Without it, there is always suffering, but she says we can feel belonging only if we have the courage to share our most authentic selves with people. Therefore, our sense of belonging, connection, can never be greater than our level of self-acceptance. Our sense of belonging will never be greater than our sense of self-acceptance. To connect, to feel awe, to be held by ritual, to belong in community, we have to know ourselves loved, fully, completely, truly, and deeply. And we have to be the ones to do it. Yet for so many of us, the mere presence of that underside, the rogue, as Goethe put it, the headstrong horse, as Plato put it, the sin, as Christianity has put it, that's enough for most of us to tell ourselves that we are not enough. Not smart enough, or quick enough, or successful enough, not pretty enough, or rich enough, or healthy enough. Too talkative or judgy, too anxious or heavy or angry or broken or sad. And I was trying to figure out why Sam's swimming makes me so sad. And it's not that I fear for him. It's mostly that I long for him. I long for him to know what it is to be held like that. To be so completely at ease that your body works naturally with the water. The 60% of you that is water on a cellular level says, I know where I am home, and you can let go. I hate watching him struggle so hard against something that has such a potential to hold him. To work against that force, this integral part of his body that is whispering, if you just relax, I've got you, you will be okay. To work against me as I hold him and say, if you just relax, I've got you, you will be okay. It just seems like such an apt metaphor. It's so terribly, awfully, wonderfully human. That tightness in our bodies, that shallow breathing, the tense, panicked flailing, or the rigid stillness, bracing ourselves against what is outside. Now, if we hike up a mountain or go for a long bike ride or marathon ourselves to exhaustion, we could potentially exercise ourselves out of that tightness for a little while. Exercise ourselves into that connection. But how many of us can regularly, without that, just sit here in the pew or at our desk or watching the news and unprompted know ourselves to be an integral part of creation? Letting ourselves be rocked by the waves and feeling them, but not bothered or overcome. And yet that is the place from which we are able to love our neighbors, the ones that society tells us that we are supposed to hate. That is the place from which we can think about the kind of generosity that challenges or uproots systems. That is the kind of place where we will be able to engender cooperation needed to confront climate change. And it is the place from which we are able to experience true joy. Real, deep joy that comes from knowing you are fully loved just as you are. And so can't you just imagine Jesus there suspended in the water, knowing all that he would face? How long do you think he allowed himself to stay under the water? Being held, feeling weightless, not even responsible for carrying himself, much less all of us. That was his last moment, really, that was just for him. Do you think John had to pull him back up, or was he ready? Was he ready for those heavens to part, however you imagine that, and declare that he was good and loved and enough? I don't think he probably was ready. But he was good, and he was loved, and he was enough. And he did let that water bring him back to the surface. And when he did, when he let go, he was met with that affirmation that traveled right to him, to his disciples, to Philip and Nathanael, to me, to you. That's what blessing does. That's what love does. It never stays. Once you know it, you can't keep it to yourself. You want to turn to somebody else and say, it's okay. You can relax. I've got you. So Jesus let that water hold him so that you would know that it'll hold you too. It's time to let go of the side, friends. You are beloved, you are enough, and you are free.